Hello and welcome. Today we discuss detective fiction and in particular why we read detective fiction and how to read detective fiction if you have that in your syllabus. So, and this question is asked very often as to why do we study popular literature, crime fiction, etc. in our bachelor's if you do literature in your undergraduate studies. So let us first understand what detective fiction really is. Now, the features of detective fiction is that you would often have a crime at the center of it, and this crime is often a murder. Sometimes it's also associated with a theft, and the plot would typically involve solving a puzzle, solving the murders. There would be mystery in there. The characters would be very memorable. You would find interesting characters, especially the detective. The detectives very often have very quirky shades in them. We would just discuss that as well. And you also have the antagonist, who is very often a very strong opposition. Antagonists are also sometimes developed very nicely. They're very intricate characters. Some of them are also very attractive. And a cardinal rule of any detective fiction is that it has to be logical, and all the suspects, all the plot points should be known to the reader. And if you're watching a film based on the novel, all of that should be known to the audience. If that is not known, they say that the cardinal rule of the detective fiction is not being followed. So it has to be logical, and all the plot points should be made public, should be made aware to the people who are reading it. Now, let us look at the iconic detectives in history and see why they are so popular and what makes them so popular. So for instance, you have idiosyncratic detectives. One of them is Hercule Poirot, who is the protagonist of Agatha Christie's novels, and he is a Belgian detective, so he speaks in a different accent. He has been, the protagonist. He has been the main detective in 33 of her novels, and he is known for his quirkiness and especially for this thick mustache. He talks differently, and in some of the later televised versions, you also see certain funny characteristics of this man. Similarly, there's this other female detective who's Miss Marple. She's an elderly spinster. So there are certain very quirky, very different, very unique characteristics of these novels. Similarly, if you look at somebody like James Bond. James Bond is also a spy. This is a kind of a spy thriller. He becomes the hero of spy thrillers. He is not a detective. He is not like Sherlock Holmes. He's not like Hercule Poirot, but he is a different kind of a protagonist who you would also find in popular literature. And so, what are the popular characteristics of somebody like James Bond? He's a spy. He's a suave. He's very very attractive, but he's also very masculine. He's good in combat. He's also good with women. He's a charmer. We also see that very often it's the white male who's playing the who is the center of the Bond novels, although it's changing. And he is also much into gadgets. So, these are the ways in which the characters of thrillers are built. Now, characters of crime novels are, therefore very smart, they're very charismatic, they're very sharp. And that's what we see in the way crime novels, become interesting to people. And that makes them very, very interesting to people who read that. But the question arises why we read them in college. Why is it that a crime novel is being taught in undergraduate levels? So the answer to that lies in the text itself. So when you read a detective fiction, you're supposed to approach the text differently. You have to read it much more closely than you would read an average novel. So for instance, the details of a romantic novel would not be very very important, right? The details of a memoir, each and every word would not be a clue, but the author of detective fiction or crime novels does throw in clues here and there, which makes it important for the reader to approach them closely. And often detective fiction is coupled with other kinds of popular literature, like for instance there would be a forensic expert, there would be a historic, this could also be historical crime fiction. So you have, you know, different kinds of people who would be interested in the sub themes of crime fiction. um, but there are many deeper reasons why students of literature are being taught these texts, and some of the reasons actually include critical thinking. It makes you think critically. It also makes you analyze the literature much more closely. It also makes you interpret it much more closely with different ways. But besides that, popular literature and detective fiction, they are great to understand the social history of a certain time, how characters are represented. They offer a lot to the students to critique. So, in a particular popular novel, you would find much more of social history than you would find in, you know, a classic of that time, because the classics are not built for popular, the things that the works which end up become classics for different reasons. So, you know, these days we are also reading detective fiction or popular literature in general to understand the way in which, for instance, you would see minority groups which are represented. So for instance, how a person with disability is being represented, or for instance, how a person with a different nationality is being represented in, say, an Agatha Christie novel, how a transgender would be represented, how a person who does not have heterosexual orientation would be represented in such novels, and it would tell us how the society would typically perceive such characters or such people. And that's also because the popular literature often uses established stereotypes and relies on them to develop plot points. So you would see many stereotypical characters in crime novels, in crime detective fiction, which is often also a critique, which is often also a pitfall of crime fiction. Now, for instance, I'll give you an example. James Bond is often seen as an idealized version of masculinity. He's embodying the traditional, you know, courage spirit. He's very cool-headed, etc. However, you are also seeing excessive smoking, excessive drinking, sometimes reckless behavior in the James Bond characters, which is also reinforcing harmful stereotypes. Now, these aspects are interesting for people to critique, right? You can critique a Bond film or a Bond novel because of such themes. And you also it would be interesting to find out why would such a character become so popular, what are the tropes of masculinity which are being used in a James Bond novel. And so therefore you can very easily look at a detective fiction from a gender perspective. You can see why is this person who is drinking a lot, who's smoking a lot, still being deemed as an attractive male person for many of the female fans. So these are interesting ways to look at popular literature. Now, however, you know, you see that it is changing today. You also have different ways in which James Bond is, for instance, being perceived by by people. Now, you have very recently in 2020, you have proposals for female James Bond to be taking over the 007 character. So slowly you're also, detective fiction is also evolving, and that's another reason why we would be reading detective fiction or popular literature, to see how society is evolving. So popular literature is very often a reflection of society much more, because it uses stereotypes much more than maybe an average romantic novel. Similarly, I gave you the example of Ian Fleming's James Bond series. You can also look at Agatha Christie's novels, and you can talk about how they are being studied and why they should be studied. So, for instance, much of Agatha Christie's fiction uses racism, right? So, some of the characters, you can look at them and you can see why racist slurs are being used. For instance, when Then There Were None, which is actually a very popular novel which has been adapted several times. You have two Indian servants there which are being portrayed in very, very stereotypical, offensive manner. So you can actually look at these novels from the perspective of post-colonialism, and you can see how racist stereotypes are also being used in such novels. Similarly, you look at sexism, you can see how, despite the fact that Christie does have a female protagonist, a female detective, in much of the other novels you see how the female stereotypes are being perpetuated. The fact that women would be depicted in one particular way, they would not be very, very nuanced. So the stereotypes of a typical female, of a typical blonde female, would be used in, say, Christie's novels as well. Similarly, another critique that is levied on criticism that is very often levied on Christie is that it's very often very stereotypical. It's formulaic, right? It uses a certain formula. So you can use the formalistic style. You can actually see how, what is the style in which the plot is generated, and what are the ploys which the author is using. So you can use various lenses to actually analyze detective fiction, and it becomes very, very interesting. Now, let's go to a deeper perspective. There is a lot of social and cultural history embedded in crime novels, in detective fiction. For one, crime fiction is a lot about human psyche. Human psyche is very interestingly explored in much of detective fiction. So you would have, say, a plot point where a war is being depicted. So it would be very interesting for you to see how a certain family in debt would be represented in in the detective fiction. Similarly, the impact of crime in society. Now, for this, I'll give you an example of how detective fiction reflects social anxieties around a crime. Now, Madhulika Little is an Indian author who's written historical crime fiction called Crimson City. Now, in that, she talks about a Mughal detective and how the social history of that time, how the crime scene would be represented, or how crime scene would be in, say, the Mughal era, and how murder would also be punished. So in the Mughal court, it is interesting to know that the murderer would be let off guard after he pays a fine, whereas there would be much harsher punishments given for treason or for somebody who's unfaithful in court. So, you understand what is the impact of crime on society if you read detective fiction of different genres. Similarly, also read about changing then gender roles. So, for instance, if you read detective fiction, say written by Agatha Christie, you would see that with Miss Marple, there is a change in the roles in which women appear, especially between the interwar time, and that is very nicely represented in Miss Marple's character. Similarly, in historical fiction or in crime fiction, which is based on the interwar period, or which is based in the Cold War, where there is rise of fascism, or where there is political turmoil in Europe, you would see the way people were affected by fascism, people were affected by Cold War. You would see that much easily reflected in detective fiction of that time. Similarly, the way technological advancements are affecting society is very nicely depicted in some of the new age crime fiction. So, for instance, there's this author called Kathy Reitz, who's a forensic scientist herself, and she has written a crime fiction, a whole series, which is called the Bones series. And this genre is actually known as forensic thriller. So, there are various ways in which technology and the advancement of technology is also being reflected in detective fiction. So, overall, the idea here is to make you understand that detective fiction often reflects the broader social and cultural context in which a certain work is written, and certain popular literature comes up, and it can provide valuable insights into the how people would behave, their fears, their concerns, their aspirations, and it would reflect the taste of the times. So this is what I had to teach you in this particular video. I'll see you again. I'll talk about something else. Thank you.